Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today, I'll just leave it a few seconds for people to join into the webinar today. My name is Gillian Askew. You might have joined a Go for Growth webinar before. If you've not, I'm one of the co-founders of Go for Growth. And we are here for the Lunch and Learn session, the first of 4 Lunch and Learn sessions where we're covering the standard selection questionnaire today. So we are in a rapid session, so I will crack straight on if that's okay as people are joining. As I said, I'm Gillian Askew, I'm one of 3 co-founders of Go for Growth. Things to note from a housekeeping perspective, the session is being recorded today. You can ask questions via the Q&A function. The chat function should also be in operation. If it's not, please just use the Q&A function if you want to ask a question, or if you have anything commentary-wise to say, please do use either of those functions. A copy of the recording and a copy of the slide deck that you see today will be sent out to all registered attendees, hopefully within 24 hours of the session today. And we are covering today the standard selection questionnaire. So we'll work through each section, giving an overview of what's required, thinking about things like the mandatory and discretionary exclusions. We are covering a lot today, and we have got it's a short time scale for a reason. We know we're fitting this in over lunchtime, so we will run exactly to time, if not a little bit earlier. What that means is we'll be working at quite a high level, and I will be cantering through quite quickly. Please do ask questions as we go if you've got them. But if you want to have a more detailed conversation, or you've got more questions that we don't get to in the session today, our contact details are at the end. So please do feel free to get in touch. So for anybody that is thinking about the standard selection questionnaire, there are 7 sections. So section 1 will usually sit, this information in section 1 will usually sit at the front end of any procurement. However, how much of the whole of the standard selection questionnaire that's at play will really be determined by how big or how complex or how much risk there is embedded in a procurement, and also what sector the procurement's in. So, for example, there is something called the light touch regime. So if that is for social care, then the light touch regime might be at play. And what that means is that there might not be a need to answer all of the sections in the standard selection questionnaire. So I'm going to run through most of it today, if not all of it today, but just be aware that not all of it will necessarily be used. In any procurement, there will be things like bidder instructions. So you will have your instructions at the front end of any procurement. Our advice is don't be overwhelmed by them, but don't ignore them either. They should give you an overview of how the process is being run. Also, do remember, in any procurement process that you've got, or grant funding application, or even things like lottery funding, etc., if you have any questions on the process, you can always come to Go for Growth. We're always here to try and help. This section 1 is going to try and capture all of your details. So I'm not going to read out what's on screen, but there's a couple of things that I wanted to pull out. So you might well be asked for something called your DUNS number, which is a Dun and Bradstreet number. Now, when we send the slides out, we'll send a link to a tutorial of how to get your DUNS number. It is our single most watched video in Go for Growth. So it is one that appears to be quite useful for organisations. You'll also be asked about your classification. So are you a voluntary sector organisation, a community interest company, for example, or a social enterprise, a charity, a mutual, etc.? You'll be asked about your classification as a business. And you'll likely be asked if you're a SME, a small to medium enterprise. And the definition of a small to medium enterprise should be contained in the tender documentation. Small organisation is normally 0 to 49 employees. And a medium-classed organisation would normally be 0 to 249 employees, although the government have just changed that to 0 to 499 employees. And usually at the top end of small to medium enterprise, you would be turning over around 50 million or under. So you could be a rather, good-sized organisation at the top end of that small to medium enterprise. But what definition is at play will be included in the tender documentation. You've got something called a person of significant control as well, which is abbreviated to PSC, and that affects both businesses and charities. So if you're a limited company, you can check your persons of significant control at Companies House. So there is a tab for people, and it will tell you about your persons of significant control. If you're a charity, the same is true. You are obliged as a charity to file a confirmation statement annually, and that's when you should also be updating your PSC register. So if you're asked about the persons of significant control, if you're a limited company or a charity, those details will be available to you via Companies House. And you might have a parent company. So if you are part of a group and you have a parent company, then you might be asked about those details as well. But you will only enter them, obviously, if they are applicable to you and to your organisation. Section 1 will also start to think about the bidding model. So how are you actually bidding? Are you bidding as part of a group of economic operators? And that's different from are you using subcontractors? So for example, if more than two businesses or more than one business comes together and you are going to deliver the contract together as a group of economic operators, then you'll be answering yes to that question. And there'll be different mechanisms that are at play for that. So in a group of economic operators, you might be setting up a special purpose vehicle, an SPV. You might be setting up a joint venture, for example. Those are legal constructs that you can do. You might be setting up a new business that pulls those organisations together. Or it might be that you have one of those economic operators that takes the lead for the bid, and they will be the legal entity into which the contract is formed. And so ultimately in any bid, there can only be one legal entity that actually takes the bid, and how that comes together will be determined by, if you are a group of economic operators, how you have decided to structure that. You'll also be asked if you're using subcontractors, or potentially you'll be asked if you're using subcontractors. And what that really means is subcontractors that are core to the delivery of the contract that you're bidding for. So it's not who our IT subcontractors are, or who we subcontract to for marketing, unless those subcontractors are actually core to the delivery of the core elements of the contract. In section 1, there's also an element of lots. So if there are different lots available or applicable in the procurement, then they will be included at something called section 1.4. And you'll be asked at that point to indicate which lots that you wish to bid for. So if there's no lots, then section 1.4 won't be included. And there will be instructions in terms of how you determine which lots that you are applying for. So it might be that you can bid for any or a combination of lots, or if you are bidding for this one, you can only bid for one other one. The instructions of how the lotting strategy works will be included in the bidding tender documents that I mentioned at the top. Just going to check that we haven't got any questions, nothing yet. So section 2, it starts to pull in exclusion grounds. So we'll send a document when we send the slide deck out that that details all of the grounds for mandatory exclusion. But as you can see on screen, it's probably what you would expect a mandatory exclusion to be constituted by. It's, they're substantial issues. And what it means is if you've fallen foul of any of those things that are on screen, or anything that's in the document that I'll send out, in terms of convictions, you would likely be excluded from the competition and therefore unable to proceed. There are exceptions to the rule, although they're very few. I'm just going to read out what the government says. So I'm going to read this out verbatim so that it's accurate. So in scope organisations, and that means the contracting authorities, in limited circumstances, disregard the existence of any grounds for mandatory exclusion. This is confined on an exceptional basis to where there are overriding reasons relating to the public interest, such as public health or protection of the environment. The ground for mandatory exclusion for breach of tax and social security obligations no longer applies where the supplier has paid or has entered into a binding arrangement with a view to paying the outstanding sums due to including any interest or fines, which is Regulation 57. In addition, this ground may be disregarded where exclusion would be clearly disproportionate, in particular where the unpaid amounts are only minor, or where the supplier did not have the opportunity yet to pay or agree to pay the outstanding amounts prior to the deadline for submitting a request to participate or tender. So that's Regulation 7.7. So there are some very few exceptions to the mandatory exclusions. In the case of discretionary exclusions around the payment of taxes and social security contributions specifically, this is checking where that you've met all your obligations relating to the payment of taxes in the country where you're established, but also in the UK. And if not, there are further details to complete and a question on any payment arrangements that are in progress or completed, including any accrued interest and/or fines that may be applicable. And in the case of discretionary exclusions, the regulations allow for, but don't mandate, that bidders should be excluded under certain grounds. And unlike the mandatory ones, they don't cover specific criminal offences. And so the decision to exclude will be taken on a case-by-case basis by the relevant contracting authority that's letting the procurement. In section 4, so more cases for discretionary exclusions. Again, this will be in the documentation that we send out, but some things in there around bankruptcy and insolvency, for example, misrepresentation, undue advantage. So some things to be wary of. You, even if you're an incumbent, you should not be asked by a contracting authority to write a specification, for example. That might give you undue advantage and therefore some influencing through the decision-making process, or it would give you an unfair advantage over other bidders because you had written the specification. Things like your environmental breaches, again, would be a discretionary exclusion ground. So, and that will be prevalent in some industries and sectors. So, again, we'll send all of the wording out so you can see them. That conflict of interest is interesting. Again, even where you're an incumbent, there are some things that you definitely shouldn't do in terms of your involvement in preparing a procurement operation. So if you're asked to get involved in that, do just be wary. And if you've got any questions, give us a shout. In terms of section 5, in generally all cases, there'll be some sort of economic and financial standing testing that will be done. And effectively, and this might seem very obvious, so forgive me if it is, but effectively contracting authorities want to be sure that who they award a contract to is financially stable enough to be able to deliver the contract throughout the whole term. Usually what you'll be asked for is to provide accounts for the last 2 years, but you will always be given an alternative option. Usually there are a couple of options to choose from, which could cover things like a statement of your annual turnover, a P&L account, an income statement, for example. You might provide your balance sheet, or a statement of financial position, statement of cash flow for the most recent years. And if you are a startup, you will, obviously not have accounts for the last 2 years. And so the alternatives are there so that the newer organisations are not disadvantaged by that process. So financial statements, a statement of funding by the bank or by your accountant, that kind of thing. There may also be in the selection process minimum levels of economic or financial standing that are at play. They will be very clear what they are and where they are and how they're applied. So, but if there is a minimum level that's at play, it will be pass or fail. So have a look out for those things in the economic and financial standing section, and have a think about whether you can comply with that. And if you can't, for any reason, our advice would be to ask a clarification question early on it to the organisation to see whether there is any discretion that can be applied for that. In terms of section 6, this is where the organisation who is letting the procurement is looking to try and understand your experience and your capability in more detail. So you'll normally be asked for references or examples of contracts that you've worked on that demonstrates your capability in the area that the contract is for. The wording currently is up to 3 examples of contracts. So it's not mandated that you have to provide 3 contract examples. And if you are a startup, for example, or if you're diversifying into a new area, there should be an alternative for you to complete. So as it stands at the minute in that section 6, if you can't provide at least 1 contract example, you will have the ability to write a narrative about your experience and capability and an explanation as to why you haven't got at least 1 contract example. So it will be thinking about how you explain what your technical and professional ability is and why you can't demonstrate that through a contract. And that, could be because you've been working on a purchase order basis. It could be that you're new to the market. It could be that you're diversifying, or you've done something similar but not on a contract basis, etc., etc. You might also be asked about subcontractors where they're used for core delivery. In the lower value contracts, it's probably unlikely, but you might be asked to evidence what a healthy supply chain looks like. And that would be thinking about paying your subcontractors using the prompt payment code, for example, or equivalent schemes in other countries. But your management tracking systems to ensure that the performance of the contract, including prompt payment, is done in the way that it should be. So depending on the size and scale of the contract, that healthy supply chain demonstration may or may not be there, but I thought it was worth just mentioning it today. We have got a couple of questions that I'm going to pick up whilst we're here. So if your company has suffered poor turnover in the last year to poor payment by clients, can you suggest how we explain that in a tender? So your turnover wouldn't necessarily be the thing that's affected by your billing. So you're invoicing your client, but they're not necessarily paying you on time. So that would affect your cash flow as opposed to your billings, your turnover. Your turnover potentially, depending on if there's any minimum economic standing, might be tested. But it's probably a question that we could do with chatting about in more detail, just to see what the actual circumstances that you might have struggled with this. If you're billing your client but your clients aren't paying, that will affect your cash flow, but it shouldn't affect your turnover because you're still billing it, although arguably it hasn't come in yet, I understand, but it is a billing that is there. And depending on whether that cash flow is what's making it difficult for you to qualify in a tender, then I think we can probably do that through clarification, or we can do that depending on how the SSQ is set up. So if you want to have a further conversation on that one in more detail, just give me a shout. The other question is, we find it difficult to provide referees as a company asking for tender bids. It's the same company where the officers can give us reference for good work. Actually, you should always be allowed to, even if you're a current supplier to the company that you're bidding with, you should always be allowed to use that company as a referee. I have seen bidders asking that question in clarifications, and I've seen organisations coming back and saying that it is fine to use them as a referee. So they can give you a reference even if you are an incumbent competitively bidding to retain that contract, if that makes sense. So hopefully that answers that question. If it doesn't for any reason, do again give me a shout afterwards. In terms of section 7, and so section 7 will cover lots of different things that might not turn up in the standard selection questionnaire. So you will almost always be asked about your insurances, which is at 7.1, and it is usually a self-certification. And it is worth mentioning at the minute that the new regulations that come out in October this year have shifted actually some of the duty, and especially for small to medium enterprises, on when you should be asked to have your insurances in place. So the wording that you might expect to see at selection stage would be, will you certify that you have or will have, if successful at contract start date, 10 million employer liability, 5 million public liability, 1 million professional indemnity, 1 million product liability, whatever those numbers are. But the shift in the regulation is you should be asked to have them in place at contract start date, not at bid point. And that's to remove barriers to entry for smaller organisations. So if you would have to take out additional insurances to provide the services or goods that you're bidding for, that's fine, but you shouldn't have to pay for those additional insurances until you have been successful in the bid process. So you shouldn't have to be shelling out any additional cost for insurances until such a point where you know you've got that covered through the bid. And that is a shift in the new regulations. So that's the kind of wording that you should see. Insurance should be proportionate to the value of the contract and the risk level in the contract and the complexity of the contract. If you don't think it is, then you can certainly use the clarification process to challenge that or question that back to the contracting authority. There is 7.2, which is data protection. So this is the wording that's in the SSQ as it stands. So please confirm that you have in place or will have in place by contract award the human and technical resources to perform the contract to ensure compliance to UK GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, and to ensure the protection of rights of the data subjects. It's usually a yes or no question. So your responses will include things like you'll be ensuring ongoing confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resilience of process systems and services, that you'll be able to comply with the rights of data subjects in respect of receiving privacy information, access, rectification, deletion, and portability of personal data, to ensure that any consent-based processing meets with the standards of active informed consents, and that those consents are recorded and auditable to ensure that legal safeguards are in place. You'll maintain records of personal data processing activities, and you'll regularly test, assess, and evaluate the effectiveness of the above measures. So those are the kinds of things that data protection, if it's in place or in force in standard selection for the particular procurement that you're bidding for, those are the kinds of things that you will be asked to be self-certifying against. And if it's a yes, no, on something like that, if you are ticking no, then you should expect that you would not meet the selection criteria. And so therefore you probably wouldn't progress any further in the process. And then there is health and safety at 7.3. So again, if this is at play, you would be asked, for example, to describe the arrangements that you've got in place to manage health and safety, controlling significant risks relevant to the requirement, including risks from use of contractors where that's relevant. And you would normally have a 500-word section for that. So if you are, for example, CHAS accredited, which is the Contractors Health and Safety Accreditation, that might be useful for that section of the SSQ. If you're not accredited with anybody, it might be about referencing what your health and safety policy is and your approach as a business to providing a safe system of work. It won't be used in every selection, and so it should be used where health and safety has a relevance to the core delivery of the contract subject. And so again, if it's there and you believe that that is irrelevant or disproportionate, then the clarification process is there for you to flag that. And then there are other sections in section 7. Now, lots of these won't apply in terms of smaller value contracts. So where we're above 5 million, payments in those contracts won't apply to the smaller, lower value. Regulation 113 may or may not apply, and public and private sector contract payments, these are usually for higher value contracts. And you can see, for example, that carbon reduction in contracts over 5 million per annum. What that means is that if the contract that you're bidding for is over £5 million per year, you would be required to have a carbon reduction plan in place. And skills and apprentices in contracts for 10 million per annum above, and in major projects at 7.9, they'll be looking at steel, and at 7.10 looking at supplier past performance. In 7.8, 7.9 and 7.10, those things are only relevant to central government contracts only as well. So you wouldn't be seeing those in smaller or even larger contracts in the wider public sector, but even in central government on things like 7.8, 7.7, you'll only be seeing them in contracts where those values are above those thresholds. And so typically you won't see those things. Now, I've put them there just to highlight them to you, but you shouldn't be seeing those things in the lower value contracts, and you certainly shouldn't be seeing them in under threshold contracts where lots of smaller organisations are active. So the final thing to say, and then we'll have 5 minutes for some questions. This can feel like it's really big and thorny and really challenging and really difficult. And we know it is actually. I've been in procurement for 30 years and it's still really thorny and difficult. And there's a lot to wrap your head around. You're not alone. Help is on hand. You can contact me or my colleague Lauren using those contact details on the screen. We've got a bookable calendar, so feel free to book into either mine or Lauren's calendar for a 30-minute Teams catch up. And then we've got lots of tutorial type resources in our video library. So it's a live link there that you can access 24/7. Hopefully there's lots of helpful resources there, but everything that we do in terms of supporting the marketplace is offered free of charge. So please don't worry that there's any kind of sort of cost or payment required to get some support if you need it. And I will open up for questions. The suppliers past performance, it would be your company's suppliers, yes, but it's for central government contracts only. So you wouldn't see that coming out in a wider public sector contract potentially. So that's usually for central government only. Are there any other questions that anybody would like to ask while we're here? Is it possible to book your seminars without going through Eventbrite, please? At the moment, it isn't, I'm afraid, no. So our booking mechanism is with Eventbrite at the minute. If there's a reason for that, do drop me an email. My details are here on the slide deck. I'd be interested just to understand what's driving that. But at the moment, no, Eventbrite is the way that you can book. But let me know why, and then we'll see if we can figure anything out. Oh, okay, impossible to use it. Okay, all right. There is a video of the social value seminar. Just depends which social value seminar you're talking about in the library. We do have some social value videos in there. We've done lots of seminars. The in-person ones we can't video, but any that have been done virtually will be in the video library. Yes, yeah, they're there. And we do have another social value session coming up. So if you go to our website, you will find details of all of our events up to and including June this year. And then during April, we'll be putting the second half of the year sessions on. So please do feel free to book on any. Apologies if Eventbrite's challenging. If you need it, drop my colleague Lauren an email and we can always book you on ourselves. So please don't let Eventbrite stop you from going to anything. If you need a bit of help with that, just give us a shout and we'll help that. I hope that's been a useful session. If anybody does, I know it was such a canter through and there's such a lot to cover. If anybody does want any further information or a chat or just over a coffee or whatever, please, I mean it, do give us a shout. We are here to help. But thank you for carving out some time, especially over a lunch hour. If you haven't eaten yet, please do go and get something to eat. And if you want to come and join us next week, we've got the next Lunch and Learn, which is next Wednesday at 12:30. We'll be looking at specification, evaluation criteria and answering quality questions. So feel free to come along to that as well. Thank you and have a really good rest of your day.